By pretty much every measure, social democratic countries outperform the United States in providing prosperity to their citizens, so it's pretty hard to argue against making the United States more like them. But, of course, that doesn't stop conservatives and libertarians from trying.
And conservatives and libertarians have been trying to explain why these social democratic countries aren't as successful as progressives believe, but that doesn't seem to be stopping PoliDice from trying to argue in favor for them.
So for this video, I'm going to debunk the top 20 arguments made against social democracy. Before we start though, I want to set our terms straight. A social democracy is a mixed market economy with an activist government that ensures that citizens have universal access to healthcare and affordable education, as well as a living wage and a strong social safety net.
So before I continue, I want to real quick discuss his definition because I see some problems with it. First thing I noticed right off the bat is a lot of the terminology he's using is very vague. For example, mixed market economy and universal healthcare can describe any number of different types of systems. For example, with universal healthcare you can have single-payer, multi-payer, compulsory insurance. A mixed market economy can be a cooperative type system where the government makes deals and offers rewards to the private sector, or a antagonistic type system where the government taxes and regulates and punishes the private sector. Activist government is vague enough to mean the government doing just about anything. For example, libertarians want the government to be very activist in enforcing the non-aggression principle. Affordable education lacks a quantifiable amount, as what's considered affordable will vary from person to person depending on disposable income, and education could mean any number of things. It doesn't necessarily mean a college degree. It could be like a trade or a certification that's inexpensive that can get a decent paying job. Also, he lumps together high taxes and high spending. The two don't necessarily go together. Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, for example, both have very high amounts of public sector spending but also really low taxes. You can have a large public sector at a low tax rate if your economy is strong, which I'll get to later in the video. Guaranteed living wages, well, quite frankly, there's no such thing. First of all, the term living wage is too vague to quantify. Second of all, if the government artificially raises the price of labor and decides they can't afford to hire you anymore, well, I guess they'll be finding that guaranteed livable wage isn't so guaranteed after all. And finally, the same problem as with a lot of these other points, the term social safety net is vague and could encompass any number of things. For example, the United States currently outdoes the rest of the world in terms of private sector charitable donations. So you could make the argument that the United States has a better social safety net than every other country in the world.
So this applies to Europe, especially the Germanic and specifically the Scandinavian countries, as well as to a lesser extent Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, and South Korea. So with that out of the way, let's begin.
So you're saying that countries can be social democracies to certain extents? So is it Boolean or is it a spectrum? By what sort of means do you measure and evaluate which countries are more socially democratic than others?
Argument number 1. If socialism is so great, how did it kill 100 million people in the 20th century? So this argument is a confusion of terminology. Pretty much nobody in the United States is calling for hardline socialism or communism. We're calling for social democracy, which is a completely different economic model from communism and hardline socialism. Anybody who makes this argument either doesn't know the difference or more likely is being willfully dishonest. Now, people like Bernie Sanders do deserve some blame for this since he insists on misusing the terms democratic socialism when he's describing social democracy, but really, people should know better than to confuse Sweden with the Soviet Union, and when right-wing commentators try to smear Bernie Sanders as a hardline socialist or even a communist, they're just outright lying to you. Like, really, show me the part of Bernie's platform where he wants to seize the means of production.
So nobody's really arguing that social democracy and socialism are 100% equivalent. What we do is we point out that they have a lot of these same fundamental issues. Both systems require forceful reallocation of privately owned property. Both suffer from issues regarding incentive structures, market signals, and allocating resources. These systems may not be identical, but they both share a lot of the same key issues. Issues that may very well end up biting Sweden in the ass just as it did the Soviet Union.
Argument number 2. Denmark and Sweden are market economies, not socialist states with planned economies. I hate this argument. It's taking the sheer dishonesty of the first argument and coming around full circle. They're taking that straw man of progressives being literal socialists, and they have the nerve to turn around and say that these countries aren't socialist when they're the ones labeling universal healthcare as socialism. This is taking empty semantic arguments to a whole nother level. Nobody is claiming that Finland is literally socialist. This really just goes to show you how intellectually desperate the right is on this issue.
So what people mean when they make this point is that they are primarily free market economies. The level to which the government is involved in the economy in Scandinavian countries isn't quite what progressives make it out to be. A lot of these countries have lower taxes and less regulations than the United States. So when people make this point, they're not saying that these countries are market economies instead of communist countries. They're market economies, and primarily market economies, more so than a mixed socialist system.
Argument number 3. Social democracies are bankrupt. Far from it. In fact, most of these countries are far more financially stable than the United States. Most of them have lower debt-GDP ratios, and almost all of them still have that AAA credit rating, which we lost several years ago.
So notice that PoliDice focuses specifically on debt to GDP ratio. The reason this is a problem is because it doesn't give us the whole story. See, all this metric tells you is the countries that are already in debt. Countries that are spending money in a way that's unsustainable may not be in the red for the time being, but that doesn't mean they can just keep doing what they're doing forever and stay out of the red. If we look at Norway as an example, the Norwegian government spends a fuck ton of money on social programs in a way that's very economically unsustainable. The reason they can pull that off without going into debt is because of oil reserves. The North and Norwegian Sea both have vast quantities of oil, and it's these oil reserves that the government's basically been using to keep its welfare programs afloat. What's the problem with that, you ask? Well, as environmental think tanks like to constantly remind us, oil is a non-renewable resource. That is, once you tap all of it, you're done. Venezuela tried to ride the oil gravy train all the way to Socialismville. Didn't quite work out for them.
Now, a few of those countries actually are in the red, which brings me to argument number 4. What about Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal? These countries really are fiscally irresponsible and riddled with corruption, but not only are they in the minority of social democracies, but it's not entirely their fault that they're in trouble. It's the European Union's fault for imposing austerity and tight money policies.
Well, first of all, when the fuck has the European Union ever imposed austerity? In libertarian circles, you'll often hear it referred to as the Fourth Reich. But more importantly, it appears as if you're blaming their failures on austerity, which is laughable when you take a minute to consider all the market advantages these countries have. Fertile soil, beachfront real estate, great tourism, strategic trade locations. Heck, a lot of these countries were at one point in history the center of massive trade empires. The only way countries like these could possibly fail economically is due to a lack of austerity, and this is evident if you look at other countries that are abundant in natural resources but have shitty economies. They tend to have authoritarian governments. And if you look at places that are resource barren, like Hong Kong, but have really strong economies, you'll see that their government is actually very libertarian.
So honestly, it's right-wing policies that are being imposed on them, like austerity. If these countries weren't part of the Eurozone, then they could devalue their currencies as necessary.
There's actually no requirement that countries adopt the euro in order to be a member of the European Union. In fact, back when Britain used to be a member of the EU, they never adopted the euro, they kept the pound. Even those countries that did adopt the euro usually still kept their original national currency. For example, I can go to Greece and still buy things either using euros or drachma. Drachma. Greece is a funny sounding currency. In fact, only a handful of EU members actually did drop their national currency and use the euro exclusively. So if devaluing their currency was absolutely essential to their economy, which I have no idea why it would be, a majority of these countries would still be able to do so.
But they're pegged to the more advanced European economies that don't provide the financial support needed to sustain the Eurozone.
Wait, is this guy seriously arguing that these countries are economically unstable because they can't deflate their currency? Yeah, people losing the purchasing power of their money leads to a better economy. Somehow. So PoliDice, if you believe that the rich should carry the higher tax burden, then monetary inflation is the last thing you should want. Because that's like the exact opposite of the progressive income tax. It hits the poor the hardest and the rich the least. And that's a problem, generally speaking, with a lot of social programs, especially with Social Security here in the United States. Because these programs create debt which deflates the currency, these programs screw over the poor way more than they help.
And speaking of those more advanced European economies, this argument really is just pure cherry picking. Like, if Mississippi didn't get help from the other states, but was still stuck using the US dollar, they'd be bankrupt real fast, maybe even a third world country.
Well, this isn't really an apt comparison. First of all, Mississippi is a state rather than its own sovereign country, so the economic situation's a little bit different. Also, Mississippi isn't trying to burden itself with a massive expensive socialist system.
Of course, not every social democracy is a success story, but The decisive majority of them are.
But does the difference between these successful and non-successful social democracies, as you call them, have anything to do with them being social democracies? The reason that some of these quote-unquote social democracies are more successful than others is, well, basically the same reason that any country is more successful than others. It has a freer economy. Sweden isn't more socialist than Greece. If anything, Sweden has less regulations than Greece. PoliDice tries to blame these countries being poor on the fact that they can't devalue their currency, which is absurd when you consider that the value of a nation's currency is more or less tied to how economically powerful it is. Now, the economy in the US may not be perfect, but since our currency is accepted pretty much everywhere in the world, that means we're probably doing something right.
Argument number 5. You may get a lot from the government.
Would you though? Because these things you're getting from the government aren't being funded in a way that's voluntary, there's no way for market signals to operate. So there's no way for people in the government to know what the optimal resource distribution is. So it may very well be the case that you're not getting a lot from the government. In countries that have single-payer systems, that is, they remove the market signals from their healthcare system, we're seeing shortages and wait times in hospitals and shit like that.
But have fun paying those taxes. If you are lower or middle income, you'll get more from the government than you'll pay in taxes.
According to who? Because value is subjective, what it means to get more out of it than you pay will vary from person to person. This is exactly why we have markets. And what if I don't end up getting more from the government than I pay in? What if there's a private sector entity that can provide all those same services but at a lower cost? Under your precious social democracy, I wouldn't have the option to opt out of the government and get those services from the private sector. Or at the very least, I could get those services from the private sector, but would still be stuck paying for the government.
And even if you're upper income, you'll have a solid safety net in case something happens to you.
Yeah, but who's to say they wouldn't have a solid safety net anyways? A lot of these wealthy people probably do put aside a rainy day fund in case something bad happens. Or better yet, put money in an annuity or 401k that they can draw on in case they need it. When you compare things like this to Social Security and other government programs, the 401k gets more bang for its buck.
Now, as I said in the Freedom Tunes video, it's good for the rich to pay higher taxes since their income is more disposable.
Sure, the rich have more disposable income, but it doesn't follow that it's a good thing to take more of it. The way the wealthy spend their disposable income is a bit different from how you and I spend our disposable income. See, most of us use our disposable income for things like video games, candy, ice cream. If you're one of the super wealthy though, then a good chunk of that disposable income is going to investments, stocks, creating businesses, building businesses, things like that. So if we take more of the wealthy's disposable income, what we're essentially doing is stepping on their feet anytime they try to grow a business. So suppose you have a business that's owned by someone who's poor or middle class. They may have gotten investors on board to help them grow their business, were it not for the government helping themselves to more of those investors' disposable income. And as was also mentioned in the Freedom Tunes video, the poor and middle class usually do benefit from these wealthier folks spending their money on even luxury goods, things like yachts and jets. People look at the shit the wealthy have, like yachts, jets, mansions, and cry about how, they're putting down the middle class, they're oppressing people with their fancy shit. And it's like, who do you think built their fancy shit? Who do you think is employed because they're buying fancy shit? Do you think yachts and jets grow on trees? If you do, please show me where that tree is. I need to fucking find it.
And by the way, the US spends much more per capita on healthcare and education than Europeans do.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they get more out of it. For example, a lot of these countries where healthcare is largely run by the government, there's a lot of rationing and wait times. You see, spending less money and getting more for what you spend isn't quite the same thing.
So if you include the costs of private premiums and tuition, then you're much better off paying the taxes.
Even if it were true that we're cheaper to pay for these things through taxes, which I highly doubt, but we'll assume for the sake of argument, that still doesn't necessarily mean that it's better to go through taxes. Because you see, the private sector option, even if more expensive, is voluntary. You have a choice whether you want to opt in or out of it. This isn't so with taxation. Taxation is compulsory. It's imposed upon you whether you agree to it or not. So even if it were true that the taxes are cheaper, in my opinion, that's a bit of a Faustian bargain, because even though you're saving some money, you're losing the freedom to choose, which in my opinion is more important.
Argument number 6. None of the Scandinavian countries have minimum wage laws or burdensome regulations, so they're more in line with laissez-faire free market capitalism. This is extremely misleading.
Well, it's not. If you look at the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, all the countries commonly cited as social democracies, that is the Nordic countries, Canada, the UK, Ireland, Hungary, all these countries rank higher than the United States on the Index of Economic Freedom. They have lower average taxes than the United States, a lower regulatory burden. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of this video I mentioned that it's possible to have a high public sector spending at a low tax rate if your economy is strong. Well, that's exactly how these countries can have the strong social safety nets that they do. Their economy isn't heavily burdened by regulations, and because of that, they can have a higher level of public sector spending at a low tax rate.
They may not have an official minimum wage, but their unions are so well backed by the government.
How are they backed by the government, though? This is the same issue we've countered in the beginning of this video. He uses this vague terminology that you could make it seem like the government doing anything is a social democracy. For example, if well backed by the government you mean that the government enforces agreements made between unions and employers, then yeah, libertarians want that.
Their effective minimum wages through collective bargaining are sometimes even higher than Bernie's goal of $15 an hour. Anyone who works in these countries makes a living wage.
I know I mentioned this in the beginning of the video, but there's issues with the concept of a livable wage, since there's so many things you have to take into account, like the consumer price index, the average cost of living, things like that, especially when you're looking at whole countries the way PoliDice is. Things like this can vary on a by-city or even by-neighborhood basis.
In fact, this is more progressive than just having a set minimum wage.
So you think it should be unions who are primarily sticking up for the rights of workers rather than government? Congratulations, you agree with libertarians on something.
And as for regulations, as you've probably heard me say, it depends on the regulation itself.
Generally speaking, you could consider regulations to be a bad thing, whatever they happen to accomplish, for two reasons. First of all is the morality of it. They're backed by a gun. You're going up to a business and saying, do this or we'll hurt you. It's usually more sugar-coated than that, but that's the basic idea. And the second reason is that they tend to hurt the economy. They force businesses to divert resources away from actually providing the good or service that they do, which results in higher prices, which results in less business being done and therefore less people employed. Now you can still argue that in spite of these, certain regulations are important, that the value that they bring outweigh these two drawbacks, but you can't hand-wave away these two drawbacks if you're arguing for regulations.
It's true that these countries have fewer unnecessary regulations.
Well, who gets to decide what makes a regulation necessary or unnecessary? Because the government doesn't have any sort of market feedback mechanism. It's all based on arbitrary whims of politicians.
But they're very strict when it comes to regulations that protect workers, consumers, and the environment.
Right, so we weren't necessarily saying that these countries have no regulations, or saying they have less regulations. And even if they're more stringent in certain areas, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be less regulated on the whole. And who's to say that these few regulations that they do have are necessary? For example, if unions are really big over there like you claim, then there shouldn't really be that much of a need for government to step in and protect workers.
Argument number 7. If these countries are so prosperous and happy, then why do they have such high suicide rates? There is absolutely no correlation between a country's level of prosperity and their suicide rate.
My ass? You think people tend to kill themselves when they're happy and prosperous and successful? You think people living in complete shitholes wish they could just end their miserable existence? Not that I think that's okay. I mean, obviously, if anyone's considering suicide, that's not good. I was recently having issues with depression and suicidal thoughts, so by no means this is an issue I do sympathize on. And of course, this isn't to say that there aren't factors other than prosperity that can cause someone to feel depressed and suicidal, but I think it's a fair assumption to make that people tend not to be suicidal or depressed when they're more successful.
In fact, these are the countries with the lowest suicide rates, so by your logic, we should aspire to be like Pakistan, Egypt, Syria, and Venezuela.
Well, of course these countries have lower suicide rates. These are all third world shitholes. There won't be a whole lot of people killing themselves when disease and starvation have beat them to it. And if anyone's saying we should aspire to be like these countries, it's you, because these countries also have big government and socialist policies.
By the way, here's a comparison between our suicide rate and the Scandinavian rates. So, yeah, argument debunked.
The 3 countries on there with a lower suicide rate rank higher on the index of economic freedom. Coincidence?
Argument number 8. Until the recent tax cuts, all of these countries had lower corporate tax rates than the US. Extremely misleading. If you adjust for loopholes and deductions, then before the Trump cuts, our effective corporate tax rate was a measly 14%, and now it's even lower.
And that completely fails to address the issue at hand. You're saying that these Scandinavian countries are successful because of their high tax rates. Why does it matter then what the tax rate is in the United States? And yeah, countries with a lower corporate tax rate tend to get more foreign investment, like Ireland and Switzerland. So if anything, bringing up corporate tax rates would make things look more favorable for the libertarian position.
Argument number 9. Okay, so maybe social democracy works in countries like Denmark, but their population is only 5.7 million. You can't expect that to work here too. I've heard lots and lots of people make this argument, but none of them have ever been able to back it up.
Well, I am. Complexity increases as you scale up. This is why you can't necessarily take a system that works for a small number of people and extrapolate how it'll work for a large number of people.
If you are someone who makes this argument, I want you to leave a comment explaining why, in detail, their population matters as specifically as you can.
Because people are diverse and have unique needs and demands, and having more people involved in your system increases the complexity of those needs and demands, so a system that works for a small number of people may not necessarily be able to work as effectively scaled up.
Sure, there are some cases where population matters, but this is not one of them. I've heard people argue that fewer people means less spending, but it also means less revenue, so what's your point?
This assumes, of course, that the revenue and spending would both scale proportionally, which anyone who knows basic econ will probably figure that's unlikely to be the case.
And more importantly, where is your completely arbitrary dividing line? Canada's population is 37 million, South Korea's population is 51 million, the UK's population is 66 million, France's population is 67 million, Germany's population is 83 million, and Japan's population is 127 million.
Well, what's arbitrary is your definition of social democracy. Because your definition is so vaguely phrased, it can literally include any country where the government does anything.
The US has 327 million people, but that's only 4 times the population of Germany, while Germany's population is 15 times Denmark's population. The ratio disparity between Denmark and Germany is 4 times that between the US and Germany. And by the way, if you are just dead convinced that we simply have too many people to have a social democracy, then we can find a way for the states to do it.
Actually, that's not a bad idea. Why not have the states implement these types of programs you like so much? That way we have more of a choice. The people who like your system can go live in the states that implement them, and the people who don't have to. This would also give us some sort of way to verify empirically whether or not such a system would work here in the United States, which I'm sure would be a good thing for PoliDice.
California is by far our largest state, and its population is less than half the population of Germany.
Yeah, let California be the country's testing ground for failed socialist plans. Heck, it's already been that for the past couple decades.
Argument number 10. But those countries are, ethnically homogenous. You can't compare that to a racially diverse country like the US. This is my favorite argument here by far. I love it.
Well, I'm sure it would be your favorite argument, on account that it's an argument that nobody makes and therefore is easy for you to pick apart.
If you're a conservative or libertarian and you make this argument, just bless you. Please keep making this argument as much as you can. It's a wonderful argument, and I want you to go down to the comment section of this video and explain to us in detail why you think the racial demographics of a country are relevant.
Okay, so nobody, I repeat, nobody makes this argument. This is a misrepresentation of the more common argument that these countries are more demographically homogeneous. So when you look at demographics, you're taking everything into account. Age, gender, not just race. And of course, people in different demographics are going to have different needs. Like older people will probably need more retirement funding, younger people need more education funding, things like that. So if your demographics are more homogeneous, then that means your needs are going to be more homogeneous, more or less. This makes those needs much easier to tackle. Now, the United States is more of a demographic hodgepodge, which is sort of the point they're trying to get across. A program that focuses on retirement funding might help states like Florida, where there's a very top-heavy age population, but not so much states with a lot of young people like New Jersey. Programs that focus on urban development might be helpful for places like New York and Virginia with a lot of cities, but if you're a very rural state, it's probably not going to help you that much. Just randomly pick any 2 states in the United States, and there's a good chance that policies that benefit one will probably screw over the other.
Argument number 11. It's easy to afford social programs when the US military is providing your national defense. First of all, it's usually the conservatives who argue that military spending isn't an issue, and that we only need to cut social spending, so this is a funny argument for them to make.
I will say I do agree with PoliDice on this point. Conservatives are a bit hypocritical when they bitch about how much taxpayer money social programs waste while still advocating for a bloated military and border wall and shit like that. While I wouldn't call myself an advocate of welfare and social programs, I'll admit they do burden the average taxpayer significantly less than the military, and corporate bailouts, which is something else that conservatives usually advocate for.
Now, there's no reason for our defense budget to be $700 billion a year, yet small government conservative types are totally cool with that.
To play devil's advocate, the civilian sector often does benefit from the military. For example, things like the internet, GPS, and penicillin all came about from military research. And progressives like to make a big deal about healthcare, while a lot of army medics do seek civilian employment once they leave their service.
Yeah, even if every single NATO country met its suggested 2% of GDP defense budget, that would only be another 1% of their GDPs. Really not a huge deal. They could slightly raise taxes or slightly cut spending, or even borrow a bit more and still be more in the green than we are. It's really not that big a deal. And by the way, this argument wrongly assumes that having a social democracy is expensive, when in fact we are the ones spending 2 to 3 times as much per capita on healthcare.
While it's true that the average European spends way less on healthcare than the average American, this is due to a number of factors, a lot of which have nothing to do with single payer. Europeans are typically more active, eat better. Also, the medical industry in Europe is way less regulated than the United States. Here in the United States, we have the AMA making doctors more expensive and the FDA making medications more expensive. Europe is way less stringent in these regards, which means they don't artificially inflate the price of healthcare the way we do over here.
We are the ones who should be worrying about how much this is costing us. Argument number 12. We spend so much more on healthcare because we're the ones funding research and development.
It's actually because of regulations, as I mentioned a moment ago, but it is true that the United States outdoes pretty much the rest of the world when it comes to medical research.
In fact, our healthcare system is so much better than those of other nations that its mere presence improves their system's quality.
Now you're just being hyperbolic.
Am I? Of the nearly 3,000 articles published in biomedical research each year, 40% of them came from the US. And of the 296,000 clinical trials running worldwide, 118,000 of them are conducted in the US. That's more than all of Europe and China combined.
If we adopted universal healthcare, then no more medical innovation would occur.
Or at least significantly less would occur since you're removing a lot of the market incentive.
It's not true, but for the sake of argument, let's assume that if we let the government negotiate drug prices...
The government can negotiate drug prices all they want. Just let me opt out and negotiate prices for myself.
Or allow us to import cheap pharmaceuticals from Canada.
He conveniently leaves out why it is that pharmaceuticals are cheaper in Canada. Here's a hint. They don't have the FDA up there.
Then they'll be forced to raise prices in Europe and Canada.
Well, they pretty much would, because you'd be injecting demand into their economies that weren't there before.
Why is that a problem?
So Mr. Progressive, what about the poor, doesn't understand why it is that having to pay more for your medication is a problem.
What happened? I thought you guys were America first. America first.
Ordinarily, a price increase like this wouldn't be a problem because it would simply signal to manufacturers that there's a shortage of medication and they would ramp up supply to try and get that price back to equilibrium. But in this case, the price increase isn't due to a shortage of medication, it's due to artificial finagling by the government. So in this case, it would send the signal to manufacturers, make more medication when there may already be a sufficient supply. This of course would cause resources to be diverted from other things that it could be put to better use for, and thus raise the price of other things.
But it's just not true. The reason we pay so much more for inexpensive pharmaceuticals is that Big Pharma lobbies against policies that would lower drug prices.
Actually, it's because they lobby in favor of policies that raise the price of drugs. This could be in the form of regulations that make it more difficult to compete with them, or patents which outright ban competing with them.
And the reason we pay so much for general health care is because of for-profit insurance companies and higher administrative costs.
If these companies are profit-seeking, wouldn't they be incentivized to keep administrative costs to a minimum? A lot of these administrative costs that the left points to as to why private for-profit insurance is bad are actually imposed by government regulations. If anything, the private for-profit system has done a lot to reduce clerical overhead through websites, apps, and different types of online services that make their service more readily accessible and convenient.
Also, that part about medical innovation is going off the myth that all progress comes from the free markets.
Well, a good majority of it does. The free market is a very competitive environment. You see, in order to turn a profit, companies have to make their customers happy and do so efficiently, and do so better than their competition. This creates huge incentive to innovate, to try and find the most efficient and effective way to create the maximum productivity or utility for their customer.
So, if the government negotiates for lower drug prices, then they'll stop innovating.
Well, one of the things that encourages companies to innovate is making more money. If the government's artificially watering down the price of drugs, that kind of puts a damper on that incentive. Why would a company go out of its way to create some sort of miracle drug if they couldn't charge a fair market price for it?
Which is nonsense. New medical products will still be extremely profitable.
Yes, but they'd be less profitable, which means you'd still probably likely see a decrease in innovation. Not to mention all the time wasted by these companies bickering with the government over prices that's time the drug isn't on the market making money.
And this argument completely ignores the impact of public R&D.
Yes, but public R&D is often driven by the private sector. Government research projects are often contracted out to private companies, so even if there was a transition to a primarily public sector research, it would still be screwed over if you screw over the economy.
It's not the CEOs and shareholders who are the ones developing these breakthroughs, it's the scientists and engineers who do.
And where do you think these scientists and engineers get their backing from? And a successful scientist who's really good at developing new drugs may very well go on to own his own business. So it may turn out that these scientists and engineers are also the CEOs as well.
And if somehow private R&D falls, then we can more than make up for it with public funds and university research.
Well, the problem with that is that because this research would be funded coercively and not through the market, there'd basically be no incentive to develop a breakthrough quickly and at a low cost. This is why the public sector has always been technologically behind the game for the longest time. For example, until recently with the SpaceX launch, for the longest time NASA's been relying on technology from the 80s and even 60s. And a lot of big government agencies like the IRS, the FBI, the CIA are still using some pretty behind-the-times computers.
Yet, on tax day 2018, the IRS electronic filing system was down. Millions were attempting to e-file on that day alone, and nearly every one of them were denied. Turns out the IRS's computers were still partially relying on old assembly code meant for mid-20th century IBM mainframes, and a buggy update had caused their modern systems to come crashing down.
Jonas Salk created the polio vaccine and chose not to patent it because he didn't create it for profit. He created it to cure people.
Right, well, patents are an artificial construct of the state. They have nothing to do with capitalism. There's nothing about capitalism that dictates that the first person to do something should have the exclusive right to do it.
Speaking of which, poor, isolated communist Cuba beat the US to a lung cancer vaccine, and the US still hasn't caught up with it.
Oh my god, do you even hear yourself talking right now? Yes, of course. The fucking miracle vaccine of the century is going to come from the country that can barely feed itself and can't even afford beds for their own hospitals. Other amazing Cuban discoveries include talking dogs and unicorns that cure AIDS. It's time for you to grow up and realize people lie. The only way the Cubans came up with a vaccine for lung cancer is if starving to death counts as a vaccine. I mean, I guess you can't get lung cancer if you're fucking dead.
And even in a social democracy, and in social democracies that are around today, there are still private R&D companies.
Okay, nobody said there'd be no private sector research and development if the government controlled drug prices. We're saying there'd be less of it. Sure, these social democracies may have a lot of private research and development going on, but how much more would there be if there were no regulations?
But even today, private R&D is almost always done in cooperation with universities, nonprofits, and with taxpayer funding from the NIH.
Yeah, that kind of goes along with that point I made earlier. Most research, even done on the public tab, is ultimately done by the private sector. So in a libertarian society, you'd have a lot of the same entities doing this research. The only difference is the funding would be voluntary.
If you're really concerned about R&D, then join us in advocating for more education and research funding.
I do advocate for more research and education funding, but I think that funding should be directed toward the private sector rather than government, because I think the private sector will probably get better results for the amount that you pay in.
Argument number 13. Social programs make people lazy because they have no incentive to work for a living.
Does this guy really believe that people would continue to be as productive as they would be ordinarily when the government pays either in full or in part for you to sit on your ass?
This is the classic talking point the right-wingers use against the poor.
So we're not against the poor. If we were against the poor, we wouldn't be advocating for charity or getting rid of regulations that make it harder to find work. In fact, a lot of us oppose these programs specifically because we're not against the poor. The best way to lift people out of poverty is to make them self-sufficient. I'd be all in favor of government programs that, teach the poor vocational skills and help them get jobs. But what a lot of these programs do is just hand out money. That makes them reliant on the government and less likely that they will actually go out and be self-sufficient.
First of all, nearly all social programs have strict eligibility requirements.
Yeah, they may have these eligibility requirements, but more often than not, the people in charge of these programs just say fuck it and hand out the benefits anyways. Having more people on their program makes them look good. Having higher numbers justifies a higher budget for their department. So there isn't exactly a strong incentive to weed people out who don't actually need the benefits.
And for adults under the age of 65, they generally require you to have a job or to be actively looking for work.
Another thing to point out is that he's taking these standards for the social programs here in the United States and extrapolating that to other countries. If what you're arguing is that we should have social programs more akin to what they have in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, then you should be looking at what the eligibility requirements are in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway.
Statistically, the overwhelming majority of able-bodied adults on social programs are either working or in between jobs.
How much are they working, though? Because a lot of times you'll have people saying fuck it and getting a 4-hour-a-week job just so that they technically qualify for the welfare benefits.
and cases of fraud are a tiny percentage of the money given.
The problem with using fraud as a metric is that it varies depending on the country you're dealing with. As I've mentioned a moment ago, different countries may have different standards for what makes someone eligible for welfare benefits. So someone who would be considered a moocher under the rules in the United States may be well within their right to collect those benefits in Sweden or Norway. Whether it's considered legally justified or not, the same moral and economic issues are there. You're taking money that doesn't belong to you and handing it to other people.
And the amount given is never enough for someone to just live off welfare.
Well, maybe not from one particular benefit, but once you add them all up. For example, if I have food stamps paying for my food, I have Medicare paying for my medicine, I can sign up for disability, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and that's just on the federal level. There's a whole bunch of other benefits on the state level, and if I sign up for all of those and get them, then I can basically just ride on that for my life. And besides, isn't that what a lot of progressives want, for the welfare to be high enough for people to just live off of? I mean, you hear Andrew Yang and Elizabeth Warren talking about universal basic income all the time.
And more importantly, you know the drill. Social democratic countries are thrashing the US in terms of their employment to population ratio and labor force participation rates.
To a large extent, that's because they have less regulations that make it more difficult to hire people. Without a minimum wage or mandatory benefits or shit like that, it's way less of a pain in the ass to hire people in these countries, so of course they'd have lower unemployment than the United States. And lower unemployment doesn't necessarily mean a better economy. For example, suppose you have 100 people with PhDs in physics working at McDonald's, or you have the government hiring people to dig holes and fill them back up all day. In both these scenarios, there's low unemployment, but that doesn't necessarily mean the economy is as productive as it could be.
Argument number 14. Taxation is theft.
So you're trying to argue that taxation isn't theft? Okay, let me know what happens if you don't pay. Or what the result would be if I called up the IRS and said, "Hi there, I'd like to opt out of government services."
And healthcare is not a right.
Well, I believe in a right to health care in a negative sense. That is, I think you have the right to seek out whatever doctor's treatment or insurance plan you decide works best for you. I don't, however, believe in a right to health care in a positive sense. That is, you have a right to actual treatment. Not only does PoliDice believe in a right to health care in a positive sense, but he also doesn't believe in a right to health care in a negative sense, since he thinks the government should be able to gut your insurance plan or monopolize it or whatever.
Unless you're an anarchist.
But what if you're not an anarchist and you're still against taxation? What if you're like me and you think government should exist but it should be funded voluntarily? See, PoliDice, there's this thing called nuance. You should probably learn it.
In which case, I can't help you.
So what, you're just going to hand wave away anarchism without addressing it? See, if there's one thing this video definitely brings to light, it's that PoliDice is very poor at handling counter-arguments. He either fabricates counter-arguments nobody makes, misrepresent arguments people do make, or outright refuse to address them, like he is here with anarchism. Well, here's the thing, PoliDice. When you argue that there should be a big, powerful government that is involved in citizens' lives, that kind of presupposes that there should be a government, period. So, like it or not, anarchism is something you're going to have to address if you're taking this position. Sorry.
You believe that a democratically elected government...
So a government being democratically elected does not in and of itself make that government legitimate or fair. Hitler and Saddam Hussein were both elected, as well as Pol Pot, Mao, and Lenin. Because here's the thing about democracy, it's essentially tyranny. It's just that instead of one person's opinion being imposed onto everyone by force, it's now 51% of the population imposing their opinion onto everyone by force. It's not the same thing as freedom, contrary to popular belief.
Has a right to tax citizens.
So if you have money that you earned legitimately, that is, you didn't steal it or defraud it from somebody, then that money is rightfully yours. You earned it fair and square, and you have the right to do with it as you please. Nobody else has the right to take that money unless you give them permission. Nobody else has a right to your money. If they want your money, they have to get your consent first. And that's just the kicker with taxation. I don't recall the IRS ever asking me for my permission before they reach their hand into my paycheck.
For the benefit of society.
Well, who gets to decide what the benefit of society is? That seems vague enough to mean quite literally anything. Society isn't a person. Society is a group of people, a group of individuals, each with unique needs and desires and wants. What benefits one person might be detrimental to another. Because good and bad are relative and can't exist collectively, this is why markets are important.
You really can't pretend that a legitimate government levying taxes to fund civilization...
Hey, the only civilizations I want to fund are the video game variety. Hey, any video game where Napoleon and Cleopatra compete to build spaceships is a cool video game for me.
Is the same as an illegitimate actor mugging you.
So by positing that the government is legitimate and the mugger's illegitimate is kind of begging the question, because it presupposes the conclusion that there's a separate morality for government and the private sector, because that's essentially what you're arguing if you're saying that it's wrong for the average person to threaten money from people with violence, but not for the government, even though that government is made up of the exact same Homo sapiens. So is it wrong for me to threaten someone with violence if they don't pay for my healthcare? How about if I get someone else to do it on my behalf? Because suppose the person that was mugging you to get you to pay for their health care instead walked into a voting booth and voted for a candidate who supports Medicare for all. It's basically the same thing. Someone is saying you should be threatened with violence if you don't pay for my health care. They're just doing it in a more indirect way.
So the overwhelming majority of us agree that taxes should exist and we should have a government.
Well, that's the bandwagon fallacy. Segregation, slavery, the Jim Crow laws, the Salem witch trials, these are all things that at one point a majority of people supported. Doesn't mean they're good ideas.
But we disagree on what the role of government should be.
Then join me in advocating for panarchism then. Why impose one system of government onto everybody when we can let everybody kind of decide which system of government they'd prefer? Yeah, here's the thing, PoliDice. In a libertarian society, you could buy a piece of land and start your own little democratic commune on it and nobody will stop you. So long as everyone who's participating is doing so of their own volition, as you're not coercing people to participate.
Hence the claim that healthcare is not a right.
Well, yeah, it's a right in a negative sense, definitely. I don't think the government or anyone should interfere with your right to seek out treatment, but positive rights can't exist because they're logically inconsistent. Saying that you have a right to healthcare or any other commodity in a positive sense implies that you have a right to the time and labor needed to produce that commodity, and if you have a right to somebody else's time and labor, well then that's slavery. The reason positive rights entail slavery is because they logically entail placing an obligation onto someone they never agreed to.
Just so we're clear, nobody actually believes that healthcare is just another commodity and not a right.
Well, this is a false dichotomy. He's setting the situation up so to be as if you either believe healthcare is just another commodity, no different from others, or a right that you're entitled to in a positive sense. Now, of course, I do believe that healthcare is definitely different from other commodities. The prices are a bit more sticky. The way the demand structure works is different for healthcare than other commodities. So yeah, it's a different commodity, but that doesn't necessarily make it a right. It may be a different type of commodity, but at the end of the day, it's still a commodity. It still takes resources to produce. The laws of economics and reality don't all of a sudden change because a certain commodity is life or death. If that were the case, you could make similar arguments for universal food or universal clothing or universal housing, which I'm sure a lot of progressives probably do now that I think about it.
Let me ask you a question. If a child isn't doing well in school, do their parents have a right to say, I won't buy you any more video games if you don't get straight A's and B's this semester? So, bad grades, no video games. Is a parent allowed to do that? Yeah, I think we can all agree that's reasonable. Now, does the parent have a right to say, if you don't get straight A's and B's this semester, then I won't take you to the hospital. If you break your neck or get run over, then tough luck. Bad grades, no medical treatment. How come the disparity? Why can a parent deny their kids video games but not health care?
This analogy is just so disingenuous on a number of levels. Putting aside the fact that no sane parent would ever do anything like this, the parent has an obligation to take care of the child, and this is an obligation they voluntarily accepted by either adopting or having sex without a condom. So it's very clear where a parent's obligation to provide health care to their child comes from. However, my obligation to provide health care to complete random strangers, on the other hand, seems to lack any sort of basis for justification. I can point to when the parent agreed to the responsibility to take care of the child, but explain to me specifically when I accepted the responsibility to provide health care to random people.
Because we all agree that video games are a commodity while healthcare is a basic human right.
Well, first of all, it doesn't really matter what most people think because, again, the bandwagon fallacy. If you want to argue that something is a commodity or a human right, you have to use actual logic and not just appeal to the crowd. Second of all, healthcare is very much so a commodity. It's a resource that there's a demand for, and that's based on limited resources. Sorry, but reality doesn't let you just pull more resources out of your ass because of your emotions. And finally, there's no such thing as positive rights, because saying that you have a right to something in a positive sense entails that you have the right to the time and labor needed to produce that. And being entitled to someone else's time and labor is literally the definition of slavery.
Argument number 15. We believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. So do we. In fact, we believe in equality of opportunity the most.
Considering you support regulations that more or less take away a lot of these opportunities, I have reasons to doubt that.
While conservatives only believe in equality under the law.
Equality under the law is equality of opportunity. Under a libertarian system where all laws are based on the non-aggression principle, nobody gets any special advantages or treatment from the government. The government just kind of levels the playing field and lets everyone work hard for their own success.
If you're born to a poor family, then you don't have the same access to education, healthcare, or jobs that those born wealthy do.
Perhaps, but at the same time you may not necessarily need the same exact education as the rich folks get. Depending what field you're in, you can get a decent paying job with a 2-year degree from a community college, or even from a certification or trade, or even joining the military. This idea that the poor are somehow condemned to poverty for life because they can't go to the most expensive Ivy League school is just flat out ridiculous.
In fact, since our schools are mainly funded by property taxes, the quality of your K-12 education is literally contingent on how wealthy your neighborhood is.
And we wouldn't have this problem if there was more of a free market for education. Yeah, I think property taxes are stupid. Why should I have to pay somebody else for the privilege of using my own property? In fact, not only do you have to pay property taxes, but you also have to follow their zoning laws and their building codes. It's like the government is a really shitty landlord where you have all the responsibilities of a tenantship but none of the benefits.
Conservatives and libertarians claim to believe in equality of opportunity, yet they want to abolish the estate tax, meaning that if you're born to rich parents, then Republicans want to make sure that you start out with even a bigger head start.
Now, even if you aren't a counter-economist, the idea of an estate tax should absolutely disgust any reasonable person. Someone you love dies, wants to give all their property to their loved ones, and then the state comes along and steals it. They just gotta have their piece.
Speaking of Head Start, a program that helps provide low-income children with the resources and education they need to succeed, conservative think tanks and Republican politicians are trying to cut their funding while undermining the public education system in general.
Again, you wouldn't see problems like this if the education system was largely privatized. You see, if this Head Start program was funded voluntarily through the private sector, then there's nothing the Republicans could do to defund it.
So much for equal opportunity. Argument number 16. Social programs are a Ponzi scheme. They rely on a diminishing pool of young people to support a growing elderly population.
So in order to understand this argument, you first have to know what a Ponzi scheme is. A Ponzi scheme is when investments are paid back not through actual growth or return, but from additional principles. So suppose that you invest $200 into a business, and the business owner turns around and gives you $500. Ideally, this $300 return would come from growth of the business. But in a Ponzi scheme, the business owner would have just went to another investor and said, hey, can I give me $500 and I'll give you $1,000. And he finds another investor who will give him $1,000 in return for $5,000, and another person who will give him $5,000 in return for $10,000, and so forth and so forth. Now here's why Ponzi schemes are a problem. When a return on investment comes from actual growth, that's sustainable. You can continue to pay back your investors indefinitely. Not so with a Ponzi scheme. I'm sure you've heard of what's called the snowball effect. Imagine on a cold winter day walking out in the snow, making a little ball of snow. Now imagine placing that ball of snow on the ground and rolling it along, picking up snow as it rolls, getting bigger. Well, as you continue to roll the ball, and as the ball grows, as it gets bigger, it gets harder and harder to push. And eventually it gets to the point where it's so big you can't even push it anymore. Well, with a Ponzi scheme, the additional principal you need to pay off the previous investors gets bigger and bigger until eventually you can't find anyone to supply it. And at this point the scheme collapses and a bunch of investors are screwed over. So as you can see, Ponzi schemes are very detrimental to the economy, which is why they're illegal for us, but as par for the core, government gets its own little exceptions to its rules.
This is a concern for every country with an aging population. This has nothing to do with social programs.
Actually, it has everything to do with social programs. The only reason an aging population poses a problem to Social Security is that it's unsustainable. If we had more sustainable ways of supporting the elderly, like IRAs and annuities, the aging population wouldn't be a problem. Well, okay, there's several problems that come with an aging population, but at least it wouldn't be a financial problem. And yes, we still have IRAs and annuities today, plenty of them, but the amount of money being invested into these more sustainable retirement plans plummeted once Social Security was passed.
Unless, now, I want you to really think about what this argument means. It might sound convincing at first, but really think about it. How does this argument translate to real-world policy? You get it? They're advocating that since we have an aging population, we need to kick the elderly off of programs like Social Security and Medicare.
Well, I don't. I'm not against Social Security and Medicare, I just think we should find a more sustainable way of funding it. And even if we did outright abolish Social Security and Medicare, well, that still wouldn't mean the elderly are SOL. As I've mentioned previously, we have annuities, IRAs, retirement plans, retirement accounts, health insurance, retirement insurance, unemployment insurance, a shit ton of different things that can help take care of the elderly once they reach retirement age. This is that typical authoritarian argument that if government doesn't do it, then nobody does.
That take care of the elderly. These sociopaths have to pay for their tax cuts somehow.
So you think the elderly in our country should be at the mercy of some monolithic bureaucratic system that's unsustainable, that people are forced to pay for against their will, instead of being able to freely choose among many different sustainable options in the marketplace, and we're the sociopaths. Yeah, that's real rich, buddy.
Even if it means cutting, reforming, privatizing, or even just eliminating these essential programs.
Notice how he just lumps all of these things together. He makes it seem like if you think that Social Security or Medicare should be changed or improved somehow, you basically hate old people. And he's very vague about it too, like he mentions reforming and privatizing these programs, but he never goes into detail as to why this would be a problem. For example, reforming Social Security can mean any number of things. Heck, a lot of Democrats want to reform Social Security, but in a way that's a little less libertarian. I also want to reform Social Security. I want to make it sustainable. I don't want the elderly to be relying on an economic ticking time bomb because I actually care about them, and I'm not just using them as political fodder to push socialism. And what's the problem with privatizing these programs? I mean, we already have examples of private sector retirement plans and programs that provide health care to the elderly. The private sector can give us cars, computers, cell phones, and all this complicated shit, but for one reason or another, it can't make sure old people don't starve.
All we need to do is eliminate the cap on FICA taxes and make some other cuts like our ridiculous defense budget, and we're fine.
You'd be fine for the time being. However much you increase revenue, at the end of the day, these programs are still unsustainable. Until they're replaced with something sustainable, you're not addressing the issue. You're basically just buying a longer grace period.
Now, an aging population isn't an immediate problem due to immigration.
He's correct on this point regarding immigration. However, the stuff he advocates for is likely to hamper the economy and reduce the number of opportunities which draw immigrants to come to our country.
But population dynamics are a problem for the entire world, really, and we need solutions that don't involve screwing over the elderly.
But that's exactly what Social Security does. Not only is it unsustainable, as I've discussed in depth, but you're disincentivized from seeking out things that would be more sustainable because you're forced to pay for it whether you want it or not. This results in the elderly basically being entangled into government tentacles, because they're basically forced into government dependency instead of being able to be free to choose something that's more self-sustaining.
Argument number 17. Social democracy inevitably leads to National Socialism or communism. My response to this is, when? Where?
Pretty much everywhere it's been implemented. You think Nazi Germany or Soviet Union suddenly became authoritarian in the blink of an eye overnight? No, what happened is Hitler and Stalin made out the same types of promises to get elected. You know, we're going to regulate companies, we're going to have these social programs, we're going to help the poor, the government's going to have a larger role in people's lives. And we see the problem is once you get that government growth ball rolling, it's kind of hard to stop.
How?
Because once people accept that mentality that the government is our Lord and Savior and is here to solve all our problems, people become less critical of government authority. In fact, in the case of social democracy, since this is the type of culture in which people are critical of capitalism, any problems, whether or not attributable to capitalism, will be blamed on capitalism, and people will blame, the free market and call for bigger government, even if it's ultimately government, which ends up causing the problem. I think Filthy Heretic put it best. Government is the only institution in the world that gets rewarded for fucking up.
There are dozens of social democracies, and these countries are generally more democratic than the US.
Yeah, a country can be democratic and socialist or fascist. Hitler and Stalin were both elected. As has been pointed out by libertarians time and time again, democracy is not the same thing as freedom. Free and at the mercy of public opinion are totally different.
Like, really, think this through. In order for Norway to become communist, the Red Party would have to suddenly sweep the elections, and if they implement communism, assuming it fails, the Norwegian people will just vote them out come next election.
Yes, but how much damage would be done in the interim? And who's to say the candidate that replaces them won't try similar bullshit? Because there's several important things you have to remember. Politicians generally aren't obligated to follow through with their promises, and government power never tends to get smaller. If the Red Party balloons up government, then it's unlikely another candidate will come in and undo that.
The far left and far right are a small, fringe minority in most European countries. They are never coming to power in mainstream European countries. Just look how small they are in the parliament.
Yeah, just because they're small doesn't necessarily mean they're not influential. For example, politicians in those fringe groups may try to influence some of the less radical politicians, and it wouldn't be too difficult for them either since there's already a culture of big government. And just because they're small now doesn't mean they won't grow. And again, since this is a culture where everything is capitalism's fault and government is our Lord and Savior, I don't imagine it would be too difficult for them to grow.
And even then, those radical parties aren't actual communists and Nazis. They're just really far left or far right nationalists.
But that's what communists and Nazis are, basically. It would be kind of like saying, well, there's no steam or ice, they're just really, really hot or really, really cold water.
And, by the way, speaking of how they can just move away from this democratically, why is it that no social democracy has ever given up its system for an American-style system.
Probably because they don't have a choice. The thing about a lot of these government programs is that as they work in these countries, they're more or less imposed onto you. There's no way to opt out or to say, no thank you, I'd rather keep that tax money and just get that same service from a private sector company. You can't really use the fact that they stick with these types of systems as a way to argue that these systems are good, since at the end of the day, these systems are ultimately imposed onto people.
Because social democracy works.
Well, sure, it works for now, but as is the problem with any socialist system, as soon as your cash cow runs dry, whether that cash cow be oil or rich people or whatever, you basically have no recourse because these systems aren't profit-driven, they're not sustainable. Famous quote from Margaret Thatcher, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money.
Argument number 18. The NHS and the VA are failures. Actually, they're not failures.
So in the NHS, hospitals are having a hard time getting patients water to drink. No, not even medicine, not even actual medical procedures, just fucking water to drink. NHS is not a failure, my ass crack.
But they have been having problems recently, and these problems are caused by right-wing politicians cutting their budgets.
So PoliDice is basically trying to blame the problem with these systems on conservatives, which is laughable since in the UK, the political climate is largely liberal, and conservatives are very supportive of the military, so if there's anything they would want funded well, it's the VA. No, PoliDice, the real problem with these systems is that they're socialist, there's no way for market signals to operate, there's no feedback mechanism to signal what the ideal distribution of resources would be, and just like any other socialized thing, this leads to rationing. These are problems inherent to the system, and it has nothing to do with conservatives.
This is the starve the beast strategy. Right-wingers screw over government programs and then blame the programs for their problems.
Assuming that it were true, that there was some sort of conspiracy going on among conservatives to purposefully sabotage government programs to make them look bad, well, in my opinion, the fact that this strategy even works in the first place is an argument against relying on government. I mentioned this earlier, but if these services were provided by the free market and everyone was contributing to them voluntarily, conservatives couldn't do jack shit to defund them.
And, by the way, those are socialized healthcare programs, which I'm on board with, but we're not really aiming for those. We're calling for just a single-payer system like Medicare.
Well, strictly speaking, single-payer is still socialized. It's just only socializing the insurance, but still actually leaving the healthcare to the private sector.
Argument number 19. Single-payer systems mean rationing and wait times. There is some truth to this, but it's not for emergencies. It's for elective procedures like hip replacements or eye surgery.
Well, actually, there's been plenty of instances in the UK of elective procedures being given higher priority than essential life-saving procedures.
If you have an emergency, then they'll treat you immediately.
Yeah, tell that to the lady in Wales that had to wait 9 hours for an ambulance. The American healthcare system may be ridiculously overpriced, but one thing you can't say about it is that the healthcare is never available when you need it.
And you won't have to worry about your ability to pay.
Well, you may not have to worry about your ability to pay, but there's definitely other things you'll have to worry about. For example, while you're laying there in the hospital bed, you'll have to ponder, since I'm not footing the bill, what sort of leverage do I have to demand a good service? And you have to consider that this hospital gets funded even if they provide a shitty service. You know, with all these thoughts going through my head, I'd much rather pay.
Speaking of which, we ration healthcare too, but we do so based on ability to pay rather than need.
Well, strictly speaking, any system will involve some extent of rationing. There's only so many resources to go around, and you have to determine what's the optimal way to distribute these resources. The reason it's preferable to ration based on ability to pay rather than need is because this encourages the most efficient use of the limited resources that they have to provide medicine. Imagine if everyone just started going to the hospital every time they had a cold. Can you imagine how just unbelievably backlogged that hospital would be, and how many people would basically not get the treatment they need because the doctors would all be sidetracked dealing with people with their little bullshit colds and coughs? Rationing based on ability to pay encourages people to economize, and as it turns out, in a system that encourages optimization and economization, things are typically cheaper and more accessible, so it may very well end up being the case that the people who can afford it are also the people who need it.
Not only will you get excellent treatment in countries like Sweden,
I wouldn't hold your breath on that. So the information I'm about to show you is from an article called Sweden's Healthcare is an Embarrassment. And this article is from a news organization called The Local, which is a Swedish news organization. So this article is from Sweden, from the horse's mouth. According to the data presented in this article, Sweden actually has one of the worst healthcare systems in Europe, worse than some of Europe's poorest countries. If you're in Stockholm and you need a medical professional, you could be waiting from 7 days up to a month. And it's not due to a lack of resources, funding, or doctors, as the article points out. In fact, Sweden actually has one of the world's most funded healthcare systems. This is just a typical problem with socialism. An abundance of resources doesn't mean anything if there's no way to optimally distribute those resources.
They will actually send a doctor or nurse to your home to continue your treatment.
And you know what? Without regulations impeding the free market, we may see similar developments here in the United States. In fact, at one libertarian debate, one of the candidates pointed out the possibility of Uber Doctor. Imagine anytime you were sick or needed medical help, you could just pull out your phone, push a button, and a doctor was on their way. Think about it. There's apps where you push a button and a cab is on its way. You push a button and food is on its way. Why can't we have that for healthcare?
The only reason wait times are shorter in the US is that fewer people are being treated, and they're going to the doctor less often because they can't afford it.
So you're admitting that making healthcare free bloats the system with artificial demand. Think for a moment, if you got to just see a doctor for free every single time you had the slightest thing wrong with you, how fucking backlogged would the hospitals be? Like you wake up in the morning and stub your toe, time to go to the hospital, or maybe you're in the kitchen preparing a salad and you accidentally cut your finger. A little bit of cream and a band-aid would fix this up, but nah, I'll go ahead and put it on the public tab.
Argument number 20. Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans were murdered by socialized healthcare.
And they're not the only ones. There's story after story of people in the NHS being denied healthcare purposefully so that they would die and not burden the system. They tend to focus on healthier patients because they're easy to treat and move in and out of the system. So as it turns out, the NHS, to a large extent, focuses on healthier patients while avoiding the more sick and desperate ones. It's almost as if the socialized healthcare system does the very thing people say we need it to prevent. So I'm sure you've all heard the common left-wing talking point, oh, private insurance companies go after healthier people and avoid sicker people, but it's documented on record that that's exactly what the NHS does.
First of all, the NHS is, again, socialized healthcare rather than a typical single-payer system, but the right-wing misinformation campaign here is absolutely disgusting. These were terminally ill cases. The babies were going to die no matter what from mitochondrial DNA depletion and neurodegeneration.
Well, since you're one to talk about misinformation campaigns, Alfie Evans didn't actually have neurodegeneration. He had a chest infection that was perfectly treatable. The NHS wrote it off as neurodegeneration to cover their asses if he died from lack of treatment.
The controversy was about if the parents could try experimental treatments that weren't even going to save their lives.
Well, I mean, if they're going to die anyway, you might as well try them. Any even remotely sane, rational parent in that situation would be like, yeah, I'll prefer a slim chance of my child's survival over a guaranteed death.
Nothing was going to save them. They were just going to give them a slow, painful death.
Well, some doctors in Italy would have disagreed with you on that. You see, Italy actually has one of the best healthcare systems in Europe. They actually had very low COVID-19 outbreaks compared to the rest of Europe. If there was a place in Europe I'd prefer to get sick, it would be Italy. But now that I think about it, all that wine and spicy sausage would probably give you a tummy ache. But anyways, some Italian doctors reached out to this couple and said, hey, unlike your shitty ass-backwards socialist healthcare system, our free market healthcare system came up with a treatment that might actually save this kid's life. And the parents were like, great, we'll take our kids to Italy to get treatment. And the British government was like, nope.
These treatments were found to be futile and inhumane.
Well, you know what strikes me as humane? The British government going up to these parents and basically saying, by law, we are going to guarantee that your kids die. We're not going to allow you to try experimental treatments. We're not even going to allow you to leave the country to get treated under a different system. The British government basically set in stone, went up to these parents and said, your children are going to die and we will make sure of that. And if that's not difficult for you to stomach, then I don't know what to tell you.
They were scams.
These parents spent their whole lives basically being forced to pay into this healthcare system that ultimately ended up killing their children. Now that's the real scam here.
Instead, these babies were freely cared for by the NHS and given a dignified death instead of a slow and painful one. It's disgusting how right-wingers have been spreading lies about this case to demonize universal healthcare.
Oh, trust me, you don't need right-wingers to do that. Universal healthcare demonizes itself perfectly well. I mean, it would be one thing if they just passively refused to treat the kids and let them die, but no, the British government went out of its way to make sure these kids die. They filed court orders to try and bypass the parents' custodial guardianship to try and get the kid off life support, which the parents tried appealing multiple times but to no avail, and they wouldn't even at the very least allow them to leave the country and find someone who would treat the kids. Yeah, the NHS doesn't need right-wingers to demonize them. They've done quite a swell job of that themselves.
Because of our for-profit healthcare system, 45,000 Americans die every year due to inability to afford coverage. So in the time that these two babies died, 45,000 Americans died, and in total 40 million Americans have gone bankrupt due to medical bills. Yet these right-wingers could not care less. In fact, they want to reduce access to healthcare for poor Americans, so even more die and go bankrupt. So I really don't buy their fake outrage over 2 inevitable deaths and 0 medical bankruptcies in the UK.
Quite honestly, PoliDice, I think you're the one with the fake outrage. You claim to be outraged about the massive expense of medical care in the United States, which isn't an unwarranted outrage, I'll admit, but I don't think your outrage is truly genuine because you're not taking the time to consider the possibility that the very government you're sucking up to deal with these problems might also be the very government that caused these problems. You see, when left-wingers criticize American healthcare, they go on and on about the greedy for-profit insurance companies, but what they never mention is stuff like the FDA inflating the cost of pharmaceuticals, or the AMA making it more difficult to become a doctor, or literally requiring permission from your competition in order to build a new hospital. If you're someone who advocates for universal healthcare or single payer, and you either blame all the problems of their healthcare system on the free market, or don't consider how the very government you're kissing up to caused a lot of these problems with their healthcare system, then quite frankly it's going to be difficult for me to take you seriously.
So that's my video debunking those 20 arguments against social democracy.
And that was my video responding to it. So you could basically take all these arguments and put them into 1 of 3 categories. Arguments that nobody makes, arguments that people do make but he misrepresents, or legitimate arguments that people do make and that he does represent properly but fails to address. On top of that, he uses a lot of vague terminology and assumptions, like taxation isn't theft because democracy is legitimate, without backing up an explanation as to why that's the case. But I do think this video is good to respond to because I feel like it really brings out an aspect of PoliDice that gets on my nerves and probably a lot of other people's nerves, and that's how he handles counter-arguments. You can see his responses to most of these involved either vague explanations, misrepresentations of what was actually argued, or just flat out not addressing it. Unless you're an anarchist, in which case I can't help you. Overall, I just think this was a very poorly thought out video. I think PoliDice definitely could have put more effort into it. Just like you kind folks can put more effort into supporting me. Links to Patreon and PayPal will be in the description. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.